This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
JJ McCarthy's ascension continues. Next on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Carter. Waits for it. Tip. Caught.
They said you can't beat Ohio State. Now what?
Brady gets terrific. Turns it. Get it. Touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, I'm Steve Deace, and welcome to this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. And we hope that it doesn't sound like a repeat of last week's Open, but we kind of just saw a lot of the exact same game. Now, Michigan's running game was a little less meh, but it was still pretty meh. And again, teams just kind of selling out to stop the run, playing a lot of man, a lot of cover one, a lot of cover zero, and JJ McCarthy making them pay. And with some high-level throws and throwing into some tight windows, showing some touch, the full repertoire. We've got checkdowns, we've got deep throws, we've got catching guys in stride so they can go in and score with the catch. You've seen it all. We even saw him run the ball a couple of times against UNLV last week as well. You're going to see that more, I think, as we get into the latter parts of the season against stiffer competition like Penn State and Ohio State. The kind of stuff, frankly, that's kind of irrespective of opponent. Tight window throws are tight window throws. Seeing and reading the whole field is seeing and reading the entire field. And he's doing those things right now. And really with a level of touch, volume on the throw, athleticism, keeping his eyes downfield to make plays with his arm rather than just kind of, fight or flight. These are things we've not seen from a Michigan quarterback in a long time. And that's why every single meaningful Michigan passing record is now finally threatened, because a lot of these records are pretty pedestrian given what goes on across much of the rest of the country. Now, I still think the true test of this is going to come later in the year when Harbaugh comes back. Is Harbaugh okay with JJ throwing this much, even against defenses that are begging for it? What's the old line? The only person that could keep Michael Jordan under 20 points was Dean Smith. I mean, Michigan is operating right now at 50-50 in terms of run-pass ratio. Is Jimmy going to be okay with that? If teams continue to sell out against the run, and teams are going to have to make a choice here pretty soon. Are you content with just letting JJ McCarthy build a Heisman Trophy resume against this kind of coverage, Or are you going to back off and try to play us straight up? And then that's where the Michigan running game, which has proven itself to be among the nation's elite, and a lot of these exact same guys are back for a third go-around, that's maybe when the running game reasserts itself. But that's going to come later on down the line. Maybe not that later. Maybe in 2 weeks against Rutgers, which has shown it's really not that intimidated against Michigan. Played us down to the final possession in 2021. Led us at the half in 2022. You know, those Michigan teams went on to win the Big Ten championship. So Rutgers was playing good football right now. They've only given up a combined 80 yards rushing so far this year. They're over a touchdown favorite against Virginia Tech this weekend. Very likely the Scarlet Knights come to Michigan for the Big Ten opener 3-0. And you know Greg Schiano, a defensive guy. So is he going to be willing to say, I mean, JJ lit him up in the second half last year. Is he going to step back and say, we're going to play a more even up, see if we can play the run with 6 or 7? Or is he going to gang up on the run as well and let JJ McCarthy pick him apart? That's maybe the first time an opponent will make that call. And then is Jimmy content to let JJ continue to fling the ball like this, especially given the backup quarterback situation? I mean, I don't want to be alarmist here, but I was listening to the Wolverines post-game podcast over the weekend, and former Michigan Wolverine Ryan Van Bergen described Michigan's backup quarterback situation as the difference between sitting first class on a private plane and then sitting next to the toilet on Spirit Airlines. Okay, so it has not been inspiring. I mean, Davis Warren has looked completely overwhelmed the 2 attempts he's gone into the game. And so, you know, some guys just don't have it when the lights go on in the stadium. And sadly, that may be the case with Davis Warren. We don't really know about Jack Tuttle as a backup quarterback. He started some games in Indiana. Obviously, he's got to have a lot better talent around him here. He was a consensus top 200 recruit, just has never really panned out. He got injured on a cheap shot against UNLV, so we didn't see much out of him. He did turn the ball over a little too much for my liking in the spring game. Jaden Denigall came in for his first real action late in the game against UNLV, threw a nice pass, a rope down the middle of the field. The guy that I'm very curious about, though, is Alex Orji, just because of his size, speed, athleticism, the running component that he could provide with the running game we already have. That's another way to get explosives. They don't always have to be in the pass game. And we haven't seen him yet for reasons. I mean, Harbaugh said it was a substitution error. He should have gone in last week. I think we will certainly see him against Bowling Green this week. But right now, there's not a proven or let alone or functional, let alone proven backup quarterback that we know of right now on the roster that could win a game, let alone against Penn State or Ohio State, if we really needed it. So we got to keep that guy healthy. And I'm wondering if Jimmy's going to be okay with him going back there 30 times a game in dropbacks, facing a pass rush, as opposed to let's just hand it off. But what if teams say, we're not going to this year, just let you hand it off? And that's what we've seen the first 2 games. Nevertheless, McCarthy has looked exactly the way you have wanted him to look thus far. He has taken a major step forward in his development. And I think you're seeing the difference between a guy who could not throw all of last offseason because of the shoulder injury and now had an entire year of development, took all the number 1 reps in practice with no competition between him and the departed Cade McNamara. And you have seen a massive leap forward in his development. Let's hope and pray it continues. We'll talk about this and more with Mark Rogers next. Steve Deace here, and we get asked a lot, hey, how can we support what you guys are doing at Michigan Podcast? Well, now is a great time to become one of our supporters on Patreon. Patreon.com/Michigan Podcast is where you can go. Patreon.com/Michigan Podcast. And if you go there, we're going to make you a little jingle. In fact, you would have gotten these a few months ago, long before the season even started. All of my 2023 football futures bets I've made thus far. I can't recommend a selection any more than I bet this myself. And last year, if you followed my football futures bets and you bet alongside of me, you made a pretty nice ROI chunk of change by the time the season ended. So keep up to date on all things we think and do here at Michigan Podcast. Patreon.com/Michigan Podcast. But more importantly, just $5 a month. And chances are you're going to make a lot more money than that following our sports betting selections. Patreon.com/Michigan Podcast. Again, Patreon.com/Michigan Podcast. And thanks to all of you that have been supporting us already. We appreciate each and every one of you. Go Blue. Let's get the viewpoint from the other side of the scarlet and gray septic tank with our good friend and maybe the world's only reasonable bucknut, Mark Rogers, host of his own fantastic Voice of College Football channel right here on YouTube with correspondents, stringers, analysts from teams all over the country. You don't want to miss it. A lot of great info out there. Also happens to be an Ohio State fan, but don't hold that against him. Mark, good to see you again as always, brother. How are you?
Good to see you, Steve. Did we learn anything this week, though? Just another inferior opponent, just another humdrum win.
It was kind of the same exact game, really. The running game was better than it was in week one. Frankly, it couldn't have been any worse. It was better than it was in week one, but again, we saw a team, just an undersized group of 5 team, play a very TCU style of defense, just a lot of guys walking around, standing around, waiting for the ball to get snapped, and then coming downfield on an automatic, stuff every gap. And JJ McCarthy just destroying teams for doing that, with a lot of man or cover 1, cover 0 coverage, throwing into tight windows, improvising plays. I mean, last week 2 weeks ago, he set the record for best completion percentage with at least 25 throws. He did it this week with at least 30 throws. He's off to the best 2-week start by any quarterback in Michigan football history. So it's kind of the same conversation. Greg Schiano, obviously, you guys know him well. He was your DC over there at Ohio State for a bit. He's a very well-respected defensive mind. He played Michigan down to the final snap here 2 years ago in 21. That Michigan team won the Big Ten. Rutgers was leading at the half last year. That in 2022, that Michigan team won the Big Ten. I think it's going to be fascinating when he comes in here. Rutgers so far this year has only given up 80 total yards rushing. Does he say, you know what, I think if this is the Michigan running game this year, we can play you straight up? And what happens when that occurs? And how much of the meh running game Michigan has right now? It's funny, last year at this time, it was Michigan needs to throw it more for times later in the year when they're going to have to. This year, it's Michigan needs to run it better for times later in the year when they have to close games out, But I think what Schiano does here in a couple of weeks will speak volumes about how he chooses to play Michigan.
Yeah, if you expect one aspect of the offense to struggle against this kind of opponent, you would expect that it would be the passing game because there's more timing that's required, the chemistry between quarterback and the receivers. But Jim Harbaugh made a comment this week talking about how sharp JJ McCarthy is. And he said it almost to a T of the way I processed it during really the first 2 games of the season. And I didn't watch these live, but I went back and looked at most of the game. And just basically, we can tell JJ McCarthy where we want the throw. Okay, this throw is supposed to be 6 inches above the chest at this point because the defender most likely is going to be here, and he puts it right on the money. Like, he is just planting that back foot and just letting it rip with so much confidence. And he never lacked in confidence, but the way he's throwing the ball, my goodness, he could probably even play at Ohio State at this point. He's that good.
Nice. Well, he tried, remember? And you guys went with the quarterback you have now instead. So, Kyle McCord. That was Ryan Day made that choice. Here's the question. I think a lot of what I'm seeing out of JJ is irrespective of opponent. And here's why. The tight windows he is throwing into, the timing he is throwing with, the improvisational plays. I mean, there's a couple of snaps you go back and watch against UNLV where he picked up stunts and blitzes before the offensive line did. Okay. I think those are, because we're not dealing with a guy whose physical abilities we're doubting. We've seen physically what he can do. What we're talking about is the mental part of the game. Has it slowed down for him or not in the decision making? And he's checking down sometimes when he doesn't have to, just because it's a safer play, when maybe there is a throw down the field that I think I could make against UNLV, but maybe I can't make that throw late in the year against Penn State and Ohio State. So let me take that 6 or 7 yard gain right now and have second and short. I think those are since we're talking about the decision-making process and not the physical capability of a guy that's already physically proven himself, I think that stuff is kind of irrespective of opponent, but maybe I'm biased. What do you think as an Ohio State guy?
Well, I think that we can look at teams across the country that are really talented, really talented, yes, talented teams that should dominate opponents but don't have it all together, and they will still struggle against low-end teams. And so I do think that there's a distinction to be made. While we would want to see these best teams in the Big Ten be taking on, unlike 6 of them are taking on the ACC this week, but we don't get to see any of the top teams in the Big Ten in play against anyone with a pulse. You can see it because Ohio State, look at who they've played, especially even last week. They didn't look that good on offense. They didn't really kick it into gear. When the plays were there, they were just very easily executed, wide open plays. They weren't the type plays that they were being challenged on. And when they were challenged and Youngstown State was in position, Ohio State wasn't making those plays. They have a lot to work out on offense. So, yeah, it's a sliding scale in terms of what we can gauge versus inferior opponents. But I think you're onto something because I have the same thought in watching Michigan's passing game. I think most of those plays can be made against the better teams in the Big Ten, and he's making the right decisions, and he's showing superior pinpoint passing, touch, accuracy, timing, decision-making, all of that coming together. And sure, the athletic defenses at a Penn State or otherwise will make some plays on him, of course, but most of those plays will be made against anyone.
I think the biggest factor that the running game has been kind of meh. It was much better in week 2. It still wasn't up to Michigan's lofty standards of the last couple of years. But I think there's a reason for this, Mark, that has largely gone unnoticed. And I do think some of it is what people saw what TCU did last year with an undersized, defense. Just have a bunch of guys kind of stand around, lollygag around the line of scrimmage pre-snap, and then have your linemen essentially try to decide which of these guys is coming downhill to crash a gap, at post-snap. I think, UNLV and East Carolina not as talented as that TCU team was last year, but schematically, they have tried some similar things. But I think a bigger factor is the lack of JJ as a threat in the running game. Now, he did run a couple of times against UNLV, but when you look at our backup quarterback situation, I was mentioning Ryan Van Bergen was on the Wolverines postgame podcast on Saturday, and he compared watching our backup quarterbacks the first 2 weeks and the difference and the drop-off between them and JJ as riding first class on a private plane and then sitting by the toilet on Spirit Airlines. Okay, that was the difference. I mean, Davis Warren looked very shaky, like too big of a moment, not my thing. And that happens sometimes. That some guys just, there's guys that are gamers and there's guys that can do it in practice when there's not 100,000 people watching and 3 million at home, and some guys just can't. Jack Tuttle got hurt on a kind of a cheap shot. We saw what he was at Indiana, not great. He should be a little better at Michigan with, better talent around him, but that's not a guy that you want, to come into the game in the fourth quarter and try to win it for you against Penn State on the road, for example. So last 2 years, when JJ was the backup, you could bring him in to run the ball and provide that extra number in the box against the defense. And you kind of didn't worry about him getting banged up because, 2 years ago, Cade McNamara was the starter. Last year, you had Cade until about the 4th or 5th game of the year, and then he was declared out for the season. And you'll notice that he didn't run at all the rest of the year until the Ohio State game. I think that's the big factor is we're not getting these huge rushing yards, especially when the second unit comes in, because we don't have a 5-star quarterback that's a dispensable piece that we can run the ball with and get numbers in the box. We can't do that with JJ McCarthy right now. And I think that strategic advantage that helped us, get some huge rushing statistics the last 2 years just isn't there right now.
Well, first of all, did you just frame a 30-point lead against a low group of 5, low-end group of 5 as a pressure moment, which I get. Yeah,
if you're a former walk-on that's never played before, yeah. If you're Davis Warren, that's a pressure moment. Yeah.
Okay, I get it. For the average human being walking up and down the street, 100,000, yes, and trying to perform in front of that is something. But if you've signed to play at Michigan, then you should be at least ready to play in that situation. That aside, my hope was that the running game decline in the first 2 games was tied to the 2 replacement offensive linemen that have to take the spots of Ryan Hayes and Olubatimi not being as good. That's what my hope is long term, that they're just not that level of player. The other thing about the run game and JJ McCarthy's role in the run game, to me, is that regardless of how you struggle in the run game, as long as that lead is somewhat comfortable, and I anticipated being against these Big Ten opponents early in the schedule, that you still keep him out of harm's way. And he's not going to forget how to, first of all, there are going to be those improvised moments in the pass game that he can run. But in terms of calling running plays or running option plays for him, I don't think you do that until the game's in doubt, mid third quarter, late third quarter, and you stay away from that. Keep him safe, keep him out of harm's way. And, Donovan Edwards and Blake Corum, regardless of the numbers game in the box, are still the better options long term.
All right, let's talk about your team for a second, Ohio State. What's gone on there the first 2 weeks? Is it just as simple as they missed on the quarterback?
Well, I thought that if they missed on a quarterback, meaning one of the two that were in competition, then they would have the other one. So this is them possibly missing on two quarterbacks because Devin Brown, they've made their decision. They have not stated their decision as of yet, unless Ryan Day stated it just here in the last few minutes. But that Kyle McCord is going to be the starter. There's no way that Devin Brown is being limited in the number of snaps that he is, and then suddenly he's going to be unveiled as the starter against Notre Dame. He only had 13 pass attempts and only completed 7. And for as bad as the offense looked against Indiana, and even with Kyle McCord in the game against Youngstown State, it was much worse with Devin Brown. So they've missed on two quarterbacks. If they don't improve, if Kyle McCord doesn't improve, Devin Brown's not going to be given that opportunity. So think about that, because my confidence was that most likely they've got two guys. Ryan Day was telling us deep into August, I've got two guys. This is how good this situation is. Mm-hmm. So either option's a good option, but of course we'll have to make a decision. But Youngstown State, it doesn't look good right now, especially without a dominant run game.
Where is that run game? Because the interior of offensive line was supposed to be the strength, right? And the tackles were, Ryan Day was even saying at Big Ten Media Days, hey, we're looking for tackles, But the interior of that line was supposed to be pretty stout. So what's happened with the running game?
Well, especially the left tackle, Josh Simmons, is just getting blown up on a regular basis. And he is not, he's just a mess. I don't know what their lineup exactly is going to be. Luke Montgomery's an interior lineman, so they're going to take one of the guards and push them possibly to the outside, because Luke Montgomery was a top 100 player in the nation, but he's a true freshman. But there's much talk that he's going to get a look. The running game, I think, should be less Travion Henderson, and there should be other options. They go 5 deep at running back. They're very different type running backs. Now, they can't win big games against big opponents featuring Mayan Williams, but he's got to be a larger part of the game because he makes his own running room by moving defenders himself. Travion Henderson does not do that. He's a pretty running back in the open field with the right crease, with the right opening, and makes guys miss in the secondary, but he's just not the tough runner that they need right now to make their own space, their own yardage, yard after contact. Dallin Hayden, I would love to see more of him. He gained 140 yards last year against Maryland on 27 carries. So he proved to be up to the challenge of the beating, at least for 1 week. And Chip Tranum was the back that did the most damage, of course, against Michigan, where he came into the game with only 1 carry, and he played the best against Indiana. So more of Chip Tranum would be good. And forget the recruiting rankings and forget the 40 times, and let's get the guys that can make their own yardage, tough yardage, to move the sticks.
There's a notion, back to the quarterback situation, there's a notion out there, well, hey, C.J. Stroud, he kind of struggled a little bit when he first started out. So I looked it up. First 2 games of Stroud's career as a starter as a redshirt freshman. Now, McCord's been in the program. This is his 3rd or 4th year in the program. Yes. This was Stroud's 2nd year in the program. He started on the road against Minnesota, Big Ten game just like McCord, but that Minnesota team was a lot better than this Indiana team. Then he played Oregon, top 10, top 15 program in the country. In those two games, Stroud threw for 7 touchdowns and over 700 yards. It's not even the level of competition and the performance between Stroud and McCord. It's not even close, Mark. So where is this conventional wisdom coming from?
It's not coming from a source of wisdom. The issues with C.J. Stroud those first 2 weeks was not that he can't play the position. Is he going to make crucial mistakes? Because he made a couple errant throws, especially against Oregon. But the game was on the line. The game was on his shoulders. He had to throw the ball 53 times in that game. Mm-hmm. Like, he had no support in that game, and the defense didn't help them because they had long drives. If you look at that, the flow of that game, Oregon just ran the ball down Ohio State's throats at will, and C.J. Stroud was on the sideline a lot, and their drives were basically consumed with scoring, and they were pretty proficient on offense. But anyway, late in the game, he made a bad throw, scrambling out of the pocket, trying to throw on the run, and overshot a guy and threw an interception, and he did the same thing against Minnesota. So he had in 53 pass attempts probably 3 or 4 questionable decisions, one really bad decision that resulted in the interception that basically sealed the game. So it came down to one defining moment that everybody's going to make a huge narrative out of. But yeah, his best football was in front of him. Yes, he was still working through things, but working through things a couple yards shy of 500 yards against Oregon and 4 touchdown passes and 294 against Minnesota. That was him working through things. That was not what we've seen the last 2 weeks.
One more thing I want to ask you about. Penn State, based on what you've seen the first 2 weeks, they ready to join the Ohio State-Michigan tier, do you think, or do you want to wait and see what they do the next 2 weeks? They've got Illinois. Now, Illinois' defense was giving up less than 275 yards a game last year with that incredible secondary. This year, man, I mean, last week against Kansas, over 500 yards. Kansas had 28 first downs. They gave up well over 400 yards against Toledo 2 weeks ago, and were lucky to win that game. But they do have Iowa for the whiteout the next week, which probably is the best defense in that division again. And we'll have a competent, capable quarterback in Cade McNamara, who's won in Happy Valley before, so he knows how to lead a team there. And Iowa has led the nation in interceptions in the last 10 years in college football. So do you want to see Drew Aller in a game like that before you say they're ready to join the tier with the two of us, or do you think they're there now?
Oh, I think they're there now. But of course, I want to see more data points against quality competition. And the competition has been here. And I think Illinois is going to be much better, although not much better than West Virginia. But Iowa is going to be that near ultimate challenge on the defensive side of the ball. So, of course, yes, I want to see that. But while we talk about Ohio State struggling in the run game, Michigan at times struggling in the run game, Penn State has not struggled in the run game. And, West Virginia has some good athletes, and they've got some positional spots where they are really strong. It's just not a good team overall, but they're still a Power 5 team. And Penn State did a methodical job on them, working the scoreboard and stretching the lead, and they didn't come out 28-0 and lay down the hammer, but they clearly were a much better team and did what you would expect them to do. But those 2 running backs that were freshmen last year, Singleton and Allen, turning them into sophomores now, I just think makes a world of difference. And this team looks like they're going to be forced to be reckoned with. But yes, the Iowa game in particular, I want to see. The Illinois performance on defense, I really perplexed me against Kansas. That was my under the radar game that I really wanted to see in the offseason, that I was looking forward to as a non-conference showdown between seeded teams out of 2 conferences, and giving up just a shade under 500 yards to Kansas, or plus 500, I believe. Not good. They just looked a step slow and completely befuddled by Kansas's offense. So expect a bounce back from Illinois. I think this is kind of an Illinois kind of game, playing at home here. We know what happened the last time the 2 got together. So one challenge this week, and then a much greater challenge, even though it is at home in 2 weeks.
Good stuff, my friend. We'll talk to you again next week. Thank you, Mark.
Sounds good, Steve. Thank you.
This week's Twitter poll results is Michigan's meh running game thus far more a product of underwhelming offensive line play or teams completely selling out on defense to stop the run? 60% of you give the opponents credit. 40% of you think it's underwhelming offensive line play. I think it's a little bit of both, but I do think the factor I mentioned to Mark a few minutes ago, not having that extra man in the run game with JJ as a threat right now, when you had the luxury of doing that with him as a backup all of 21, first third of 2022, not having that really at all right now because you're trying to wrap him in cellophane to preserve him for the games that really count later. I think that's a big factor too. That brings us to our feedback of the week. Terrence says, what are the odds that JJ comes back with Corum and Edwards gone? If he's playing like this, brother, the odds that monkeys will fly out of my butt. Okay? Not very high. That's the bittersweet aspect of JJ playing at a Heisman Trophy All-American level as he is currently. If that continues, he gone. And he should be. He would have earned it. And we would have ended up having the kind of season or at least something approaching the kind of season we all envisioned before this season began. All right, that'll do it for this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. Don't forget to like, rate, subscribe, share, follow, 5-star review, whether you're watching here on YouTube or listening on iTunes or elsewhere. Please help us to find more Michigan fans just like you. Thank you to all of you that have hit subscribed or followed, have commented in the comment section. We appreciate all of those. Please remember as well to follow us on Twitter or X, at Michigan Podcast, especially on game days where we will likely have very overly dramatic commentary in real time you will enjoy or be annoyed by. Until the next time, that's next week. We'll see you right here on Michigan Podcast. I'm Steve Deace. Go Blue.